Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome to Intentional Conversations, a virtual community podcast. Happy Friday to each of you. We have been expecting you, and if you are accustomed to this podcast community, you know that we take a few moments at the beginning to allow our audience to get settled into the virtual community. And so feel free to locate the chat. Let us know where you're joining the conversation from. And if you feel inclined, also take a moment to share maybe your LinkedIn information. It helps us to know where people are joining this conversation from and whether or not they're interested in people from this community connecting with them beyond this hour of time. We're super excited to be in conversation today with our guest co-host, and momentarily I will provide a more formal introduction, but for now, let's just take a moment to settle in. So we have Canada. Hi, Toki. Canada's represented here today. We have New York City. Hi, Andrea. We have Amsterdam in the house, of course. We have Dallas, Texas. So super excited. I want you all to be aware that part of our commitment to disability justice for our podcast, we always make sure that the closed caption option is available. And so that is at your disposal if that is of use to you. And so thank you so much for just being mindful of that. Also want to let you know that I am being supported today by my wonderful colleagues at NWC. And I always like to shout them out because they do an incredible job of just helping us to bring this virtual podcast to life. And so I'm so appreciative. I want you to know that the chat today is going to be our way of extending our communications. And so if I say something, or if our guest co-host happens to say something that resonates with you, then please feel free to share your thoughts and sentiments into the chat. If a resource comes to mind for you that's been helpful related to maybe the content that's being shared, don't hesitate at all to, in the chat, share that resource. This is how we all can really provide support to each other. And if someone happens to share something and you want to stand in solidarity with that person, then provide those affirmations in the chat. So hopefully you get the point now. The chat is our way of continuing to foster a great level of community with each other while we're learning with and from each other today. Okay, so I want to go ahead and get us started because as usual, the hour goes by really fast. And so once again, I'm Dr. Nika White. My pronouns are she, her. I am your host for Intentional Conversations VodCast, and welcome. We're so glad you're here. All right, so again, this is Intentional Conversations, a virtual community vodcast, and we are so glad you are here, joined with us. For those of you who have been part of this community for quite some time, you are aware that we are taking the vodcast and we're adding on a podcast component. And so I want to continue to put this into your hearing so that you can share the word out with those in your network. We recognize that there's some people who love this live virtual opportunity to connect, and we will continue to offer that. But for those who also like getting their content in a podcast capacity, we are going to be making that available relatively soon. And so stay tuned for more on that. Every now and then, we also like to make sure this community is aware of some of the ways in which we like to show up for the broader community of individuals who really want to deepen their understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. And one of the ways we do so is by way of short video clips that we release weekly. It's called Inclusion Uncomplicated, How to Simplify DEI. So we invite you to connect with our YouTube channel and make sure that you are finding some ways to deepen your learning as you continue to progress as what we refer to at NWC as intentional inclusionists. So know that that resource is available to you. Now, you all are used to us sharing a little bit about what you have to look forward to in future weeks on the podcast. And so I want you to know that on next Friday, we are having a special guest to join us, Ricardo Gonzalez. And Ricardo is actually returning as an Intentional Conversations podcast host. He has just recently released a new book, To Belong or Not to Belong. And so we're going to discuss his new book, Cross-Cultural Communication is his expertise. And so I hope you will join us next Friday as we welcome Ricardo. And then the week following, we have another wonderful DEI practitioner, Dr. Shelton J Good. And in that conversation, we're going to discuss DEI efforts that yield measurable and sustainable results in the DEI world post-COVID. And so I look forward to that conversation. Lots of things to keep top of mind. And I know that Dr. Good's going to bring great insight, and look forward to having you all join us for that conversation. And then last but not least, this gives me great pleasure to take a moment to actually introduce to this group. Well, to some I'll be introducing, to others is going to be a familiar face and name, because this individual has been a part of our VodCast community for quite some time as a participant and also as a contributor by way of sharing questions and thoughts and comments. And so it just felt really appropriate for us to have him to take front and center stage and to be directly in conversation today as our guest co-host. So as I normally do, allow me to give his formal introduction, then we'll bring him on to be able to share and welcome this audience in his own way. Kobena says he doesn't just do DEI, he lives it. A native of Milwaukee and a child of an extremely diverse household, he began his lifelong journey as a student of cultures and customs. Combined with his personal mission to help others achieve their goals, he was led to the DEI field initially through thought talent acquisition, and now through leading in organizational DEI. Kobena has a master's degree in cultural foundations of education and multiple leadership and DEI professional certifications. Kobena is a master facilitator, experienced strategist, and advisor. He is also a public speaker on a variety of topics under the broad umbrella of diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. And so VodCast community, in your own way, through the chat, through some emojis, in whatever way that feels appropriate, help me to welcome my guest co-host today, Kobena Collins. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can take a moment to spotlight. I'm going to add you as a spotlight, Kobena, but welcome. Thank you for saying yes to our invite. We're so glad to be in conversation with you today in this capacity. And you know the drill because you've been a part of this community. We've read your bio. We understand some of the lens in which you bring to this work in this space of DEI, but we want you to share with us now, what do we not know about you just from reading your bio that maybe helps us to get a better understanding of how in which you see the world, how in which you show up to different spaces, maybe intersecting identities. Help us to know Kobena a little bit better. Welcome.
Thank you so much. And good morning, everybody. I appreciate all the love that's being shared in the chats as well. So you in my bio, you talked about the very unique background, and I like to just jump into that a little bit more. I found that, you know, being vulnerable is the best way to have influence in many cases, especially in this space. And so when I say a unique, diverse background, so I joke and say my mother is white, my dad is black, and somehow they had a Puerto Rican kid. Because growing up, I grew up in a neighborhood that was black, white, and Puerto Rican. There weren't a lot of mixed kids. And so for a while, I used to say, hey, just call me Marco. And, you know, I had the tail to go with it and the little earring. And, you know, because I was growing up in the age when there wasn't a whole lot of mixed kids running around, not nearly as many as there are now, you know, I wasn't black enough to be black, and I clearly wasn't white, and so I just was. You know, my best friends growing up were a Korean boy and a Japanese girl. And but what also goes into that is I grew up going to a black Afrocentric Catholic church. And so my deacon is from Ghana. I actually got the name Kobena from my deacon as I went through a rites of passage in a scholarship program when I was in high school, sponsored by Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And so, you know, those are things that ultimately led me to thinking about culture and understanding, you know, that's where I found my space. You know, I think in this D&I world and space where I'm trying to find, where do we fit into our own skin? How do we fit in our own skin? Where do we fit in society or whichever groups that we interact with on a regular basis? And the goal, I would say, for DEI is to make sure that whatever you fit everywhere, because you can be your truest authentic self anytime and any place. So
No, absolutely, Kobena. Those are words to stand on, and we appreciate you reminding us of that. So, as you were sharing your very diverse background and even all of the experiences that you've had with the relationships you were able to build and be surrounded by, it brought to mind a question oftentimes that I find myself engaged in, and that is around: is there such thing as really reaching true cultural competency? And I have my thoughts, but I certainly want to hear from you. What do you think about that? Can someone really fully be culturally competent, whatever
Well,
that means?
I think that's a loaded question, Nika. But
Yeah.
that being said, I think that it's just like, much of this work in DI, it's ever evolving.
Yes.
And, cultures change over time. When you think about back, a lot of times you think about the generational differences,
Yeah.
even within families, like, oh, we didn't do that stuff back when I was a kid, or, I was raised in a house. My father was a Vietnam veteran, Marine. So there was no asking why. If he says something, only thing you could ask was, if your father says jump, your only question is how high, right?
Mm,
And so, nowadays there's a lot more room for kids to ask why, or even in the professional space. Um, you know, when I first was a leader, I was still leading from that military mindset
right.
of, hey, just follow me, just do what I said. I got this, trust me, and we'll make it through. But my employees were not feeling that. They were, different generation, and that's culture, right? There's generational cultures, and they need to be led with the why, not with the how or the what. And so to be fully culturally competent, I think you can move towards that, but I also think, like, it's just like DEI, it's never achieved, because things are always changing.
Right. No, I love that. And that's precisely why I wanted us to spend some time on that topic, because I too am of the persuasion that full cultural competence is not something that can be achieved. It is about always having this growth mindset to want
Mm.
to deepen our understanding and our awareness. I mean, let's think about it. If we think about this entire world, there's so many different cultures that it is almost impossible for someone to be fully competent and have
Mhm.
full intelligence around all of those different cultural complexities. And so I think it's about just doing our part to continue to always be curious and open, so
Yeah,
that we can practice cultural humility and we can have a certain level of cultural intelligence that we're always interested in growing and building upon. So yeah, I love
absolutely,
that. So
absolutely.
part of your platform in this work, Kobena, is to really combine DEI and leadership into all of the strategies. And so,
Mhm.
why does it take good leaders to navigate in this DEI space? And how do you connect the two and intersect the two, leadership and DEI?
Yeah, what I'd like to say is, to start off, is there's a difference between leadership and management, right? And
Yes,
so,
yes.
one of my good friends who's also in the DEI space here in Milwaukee, he likes to say that if a leader has no followers, he's just going for a walk. And so leaders have to have influence, but they also need to have humility. They need to be able to take feedback and actively engage with others at all levels. To be a DEI leader, I think you need to flatten the organization as much as possible. Because when you think about it, I mean, just anybody who's on the call in the chat, you think about, I want you to confirm if you've ever been in this situation where you've wanted to say something, but the culture within that organization was, you don't talk to leaders. You tell your direct supervisor and hope that they take it to their supervisor, and then they take it to the C-suite executive. And
Mhm.
so, I think that's part of the role of DEI leadership, is to flatten that organization, to be able to say, hey, you can come straight to me.
Yeah.
And, a lot of times, leaders who I've seen that have struggled are those leaders who only stay in that C-suite or in that leadership
Yeah.
um, conversations. And there's a poem called "If" by Rudyard Kipling, and there's a part of that poem that talks, if you can walk with crowds and keep your virtue, or talk with kings nor lose the common touch. And so, um, it's about making sure that you traverse those multiple levels of an organization and still be a real person to everybody you interact with.
That's so
I think
good.
that's really the key to any leadership, whether it's DEI leadership or not. It's, that leadership you have to understand, and also understand you don't have to be great at everything. I think really good leadership is recognizing, hey, I'm good at A and B, but C through Z, I'm going to call Dr. Nika. I'm going to call Anam. I'm going to call Courtney. I'm going to call, Amora, all these other people, because they have, the perspectives that I need that I don't have. I have 10. I need 35 other people to complete my full 360 perspective.
Yeah, no, I appreciate so much of that. So much to unpack as well. First of all, the quote that you shared of your friends in Milwaukee, I put that into the chat because it was worth certainly amplifying. If a leader has no followers, then he, she, they are just going for a walk, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I too believe that DEI is leadership. Leadership is DEI. And so you can't really separate the two. I love when organizations, when they're, planning their leadership type of experiences, automatically the lens of DEI is layered onto that full experience because they get it. You can't separate the two. It's exactly what it instills in us, is that this is a way to influence others positively. So I really do appreciate that. So how should organizations choose leaders that are, or at least influencers that are grounded in some type of belief and value system around inclusivity and belonging? What are those skill sets or those traits and characteristics, rather, from a talent acquisition perspective, people should be tuned into to be able to know that if we have a very inclusive culture and environment, we want to make sure we can maintain that. So here's kind of what we're looking for as we're vetting talent. What are some of those things?
Yeah, again, going back to that concept of humility and vulnerability, if leaders, we should be looking for leaders who seek to pull out of others and seek to promote others as opposed to themselves. There's an article that we use all the time. It was by the Muse, and I'll put the link in a little bit later. And it talks about 7 ways to be an ally, in the workplace specifically. And it's got, 7 different ways. The 5th one is one of my favorites, because everybody, no matter who you are, can be this type of ally. And it's the scholar ally. It's the person that sometimes you shouldn't be, you definitely, as an ally, your role is not to be in front. It's to, listen, understand, and help others, get an equitable opportunity to share their experiences and their perspective and their ideas. And so that scholar ally, and with organizations, a lot of organizations have these, somebody else put it in there for me. Thank you for that. So a lot of organizations have, business resource groups or employee resource groups. And I always encourage people to join 2. One that you have a personal affinity to personally connect with, and one that you know the least about. Because the challenge in a lot of this work is people don't even know what they don't know.
Right.
I'm going to call myself out, and when I shared that quote, and you did it so gracefully, a leader is somebody, a leader without followers is a person who, how did you say? You said,
if a leader has no followers, he, she, they are just going for a walk.
Yes,
Yeah.
And you added that in there. And when it came out of my mouth, I heard it and I said, oh, I should correct that. But I didn't want to, I should have done it. But I appreciate you doing that. But a leader should be able to call themselves out, because what that does is you want somebody that can potentially lead by that example of, it's okay to make mistakes. You say, absolutely, I'm sorry, and you move on, right? It's not about, hey, you made a mistake, I'm going to beat you over the head for the next 6 months. No, you made a mistake, you recognize the mistake, we'll just do better. And if we make this mistake again, we'll try again. But being open to that. And the leader, oftentimes people they share how they feel, even though they're not saying it directly, right?
Yeah.
So that you want in your D&I space is if somebody gives you feedback, it might not be the direct feedback that you're looking for, but a leader that can recognize what they're really saying or what's the root cause of this feedback, or can dig deeper when they see that there's more to it. That's the type of leader that is going to be successful in this space.
Absolutely. 100%, 100%. So I want to bring change management into this conversation of DEI. There's definitely a great correlation there. So I want you just to talk with us about how do you see the two interconnected, and what's the value of having a change management mindset when you are really trying to navigate success in terms of DEI?
It's it's ironic that in 2 weeks, we're going to have Dr. Shelton Good. He is a mentor of mine. And when I first officially wanted to get into the greater D&I space, I've been in diversity recruitment in spaces and done some stuff in D&I for 10 plus years. But when I wanted to really dive into more of the designated DEI space, I reached out to him, and he was gracious enough to share with me that, well, if you want to get in D&I, you need to understand change management, because DEI is change management. And as I've worked with different companies, I've done different things. And one of the things we've done is IDI, which is the Intercultural Intercultural Development Index.
Yep.
And by being a facilitator of that, an assessor of that, you really understand, and going through those profiles with different people in our leadership, you understand this is challenging their life, challenging the way they live, the way they were raised, their values, their morals. A lot of this is challenging all of what they know to be right and true. Right. And so that type of change that's to the core. So to be able to understand how to get somebody to move in a way that is counterculture. We talk about culture, right? This is counterculture, counter morals. You're telling me that I've been lied to my whole life, whether purposefully or not. That's a hard pill to swallow. And so when we talk about D&I, it is change management.
Absolutely, 100%. And people don't like change. And so it definitely requires us to be even more willing to lean into all the things, all the strategies, so that we can bring as many people along, because what's going to resonate with one particular person is not necessarily going to move another. And so I too agree. I often start with, let's think about how do we manage this change? And I think part of managing that change is being very communicative. This audience has heard me say several times that resistance is a lack of clarity. So how can, through that change management strategy, we center clarity? And that means really have to build people's awareness and understanding of the why. How does this benefit all of us? Not just a select population of people, right? But all of us. And so I appreciate you bringing that to the conversation. I'll definitely have to make sure to tell Dr. Good that you gave him his credit for putting that as part of your philosophy.
Absolutely. There's another thing about with change management. There's a book called Traction.
Oh, I love Traction. My team is so familiar with it because we love EOS. Yeah, the Entrepreneur Operating System. And so, yes.
Yeah. So, in that book, it talks about, when you're thinking about your teams, and when you're thinking about it, this kind of goes back to what you were asking earlier. A lot of times, like when we're looking at creating a DEI leadership role, and organizations, they may grab the person who may have had some conversation DEI stuff, but sometimes it's all in good intention, but sometimes we don't do what Traction would talk is that GWC, right? Do they get it? Do they get what we're trying to do, where we're trying to go? Do they want it? And then do they have the capacity, right?
Get it, want it, and have the capacity. Yes, this is such familiar language to us. We love it.
I read that when I first started my staffing agency back in 2015. And one of my mentor coaches, actually, this man was younger than me. It was, we went to the same high school, but, he had taken the business route straight out of the gate. And He shared with me that book and some other things, and that book was eye-opening, especially as you think about organizational change or organizational development. And again, all of that, so what you said earlier, D&I has to be a part of the DNA.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It has to be fully embedded, part of the fabric. Right. So I'm totally aligned with you there. So I want to move and talk about strategy now, because, passion is one thing, but passion does not necessarily always move the needle to a place where we can sustain really good outcomes. And so we have to be very strategic in this discipline, just like other, disciplines. And so I know that you often talk about the 5 R's in DEI strategy. So I want you to tell us what those, well, really, there's 4 main R's, and there's one that you've added. So I want you to give this audience the benefit of understanding what are those R's relevant to how in which, you believe it's important to approach DEI strategy, and why did you feel compelled to add that 5th R?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So again, a lot of the stuff that I've learned over time is not original to me. I make tweaks and things like that, but I think it's also important, as an ally to other people, to make sure that I give other people their recognition and flowers. And I don't even know where I got the 4 R's from originally. I've done so much research and been on so many calls and videos and things like that.
I think you shared from a colleague, but still, I'm sure you've had lots of colleagues, and so, but
yeah, absolutely. So the four original R's are recruitment, retention, reputation, and representation. And so when you think about recruitment, that's the no-brainer, right? That's how do we recruit people? There's some intersections between these R's, right? They overlap. It's not just a checkbox 1, 2, 3, 4. It's more of a Venn diagram, a 4 or 5 circle Venn diagram. And so, recruitment is, your recruitment brand. How are you getting your employer brand out as a company? So people might know, an organization as a retailer. So they know what you sell, but they don't know what it's like to work there, and sometimes, say like a Nike, you might not care what it's like to work there because you get to work at Nike, right? So the consumer brand might be important enough to manage the employer brand, but other companies who may not have that same strength of a consumer brand, they may need that. And then you've got retention. There's so much that goes into retention, all the different strategies that go into retaining top talent, which in today's market, it is incredibly hard to retain talent because everybody's poaching from everybody else.
Yes.
And as a recruiter, in my background in recruitment, I mean, that a lot of times what recruiters do is they look at the person that, if I'm looking for a vice president and my company is, say it's a technology software organization, I'm going to go to my competitors and see who they have as a VP, and I'm going to call and reach out to them and say, hey, why don't you come on over here? We're better than that, and so there's so much poaching, especially in executive recruitment. But there's so much more that goes into the retention. Inclusion is key. That is a big retention tool. If I feel like I belong, if I feel like I can be my truest, authentic self, I don't need to go anywhere else. If I'm heard, if I'm valued. But then you have reputation. That's the external brand. When things are going on in society, how are you responding? How are the people who are speaking in spaces, how are they coming off as an inclusive leader? How are they consciously being inclusive when they're in rooms? And then you've got your representation. And again, that's a huge thing where all the research I've done, and I've done quite a bit, used to do some consulting with a marketing firm, and we did a lot of research, and people want to see people that look like them.
Right.
So where's the representation within the organization? Is it all at the bottom, or is there an even spread? Is it representative of the community you're serving? But the last one that I recently have added is resources, because we're all on our own journeys and we're on different planes. Some people really don't think that it's necessary, so they're going to need some some different resources. We can't take everybody on the same trip. It's almost a choose your own adventure type of scenario. And so companies are going to need to build resources. And additionally, we talked about how this is change management and this is challenging people's, mental states. What about having a psychologist or a psychotherapist on site specifically to address some of these challenges that people are going to go through? Or what if you weren't accepted by your community growing up? And say I'm a Latino and I wasn't accepted as Latino in my community because I talk too proper English in private schools. Well, there could be some different things going on that person hasn't been able to resolve. Those are other resources that are going to, one, they're going to make you a better company, but two, they're going to make people feel like you're there for them, which means they're going to give more of themselves to the company. They're going to stay longer. They're going to add more. They're going to feel free to point out things in the organization because they know that you've invested in them and they're going to invest in you. So,
yeah, no, I love how you brought that full circle, because there are many organizations that are of the persuasion, well, that's not my burden to carry. I understand that there's some issues out there that causes someone to be triggered, but we're an employer. Why is that my burden to carry? So you brought that full circle to help answer that question. And I so appreciate that. So just for the purpose of our podcast community, we're going to be shifting a little bit, and I will allow you to present your questions to Kobena. You can do that either by placing your questions into the chat. And if you put it into the chat, you're letting us know that your preference is to have your question presented on your behalf. Otherwise, we will allow you to raise your hand. We'll call on you, spotlight you, and ask that you unmute yourself and share. So I want to take maybe two more questions that I'll present to you, Kobena, while we give this audience a chance to think about what they would like to further their learning around. So we need to understand about the mental state and how it has really increased greater appetite for organizations to think more intently about how do we now play a role in helping to address the mental issues that a lot of employers are showing up to the workplace with. Mm-hmm. And specifically, I know one of the things you have a lot of energy around is the mental state of DEI and C-suite leaders of color, knowing that that space is very much populated with professionals of color, for lots of great reasons, right? Yeah. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, so there are different, what's interesting, and I think we can never recognize this enough, is the Black experience is not monolithic. The Latino experience is not monolithic. People are dynamic and communities are dynamic. And so, for example, I have a brother, same mother, same father. We have very different experiences as Black men. Our communities are that we interact with on a regular basis are incredibly different. Mm-hmm. And so when you think about the mental space of, C-suite DEI executives, one, we can't expect them to know all about even their own community that they identify with,
right?
Because that's too much to ask of any one person, and all the other executives, I think, well, I would say in my experience and from the conversations I've had, well intended, but sometimes they just don't get it because they haven't had to face these things. I would say that, and I would argue this, that most people are not compelled to make any change until something personally affects them. Mm-hmm. I give an example. When I was 16 years old, my parents sat me down, and myself and my brother, and I have 3 older sisters, and one of them was in the Marines, and she was in Okinawa at the time. She reached back out, or my parents sat us down and said, "Hey, your sister's gay." I chuckled, because at this time, we would say, and I don't do this anymore. I want to make it very clear, but in the community, in the social group, if something was foul or something was not fun or not cool, they would say, "Oh, that's gay. I'm not doing that. That's gay. Let's go play tennis. No, I'm not doing that. That's gay." And the intent was not necessarily had nothing to do with somebody's, sexual preference.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't until I found out that I had a gay sister that I felt compelled to make any changes. And so
Yeah.
when we think about the mental state of DEI leaders, they're working in a world where many of the people that they are trying to influence at the C-suite level, they haven't had any interactions that would compel them to change. Because again, we're talking about making yourself uncomfortable for perceivably no reason. Because if things are good for me, why should I make them less good for me? Why, in the sake of humanity, why would I do that, right? If thinking about we're human, we want to protect ourselves and our livelihood, and we've worked hard to get to where we are. Why would I jeopardize what I have now for no reason? So thank you again. Sexual orientation is not a preference.
An innate part of everyone's
existence. Thank you again. I make mistakes. I think also I would talk about DEI leaders in the mental state. Those leaders need to be able to make mistakes as well. Just because they're C-suite doesn't mean that they're going to be perfect. They can be perfectly imperfect, but they can't be expected to have everything right.
Yeah. One of the things I love about this community is that I think the people that show up to this space are so deeply committed to this work that, there's this huge openness of learning with and from each other, right? And providing those opportunities for people to self-reflect. And I know that's something that's really big for you. Self-reflection, self-awareness is something that I also speak a lot about. I think it's part of our way of just pausing and helping to connect with what we're hearing, what we're seeing. And through that time of reflection, I think growth can occur if we're open to it. And it's also a huge part of what you've described as being who you are and how you show forth. And so talk to us a little bit about self-reflection, self-awareness, and the criticality of that to the work of DEI.
Anybody who's in DEI must be self-reflective. Because if you're not thinking about, if you're so consumed of what others, you'll forget, one, this is stressful work, right? This Dr. Good again said, this is not a young professional's career choice. Some do, but this is challenging work. It's stressful. You have to understand how to manage that stress, expectations. You're going against the system in most cases. And we all have our own personal biases based on our own experiences. And biases is a natural part of who we are. It's our safety mechanism. But we have to be self-reflective enough to understand where our bias is, right? There is, my master's degree was in education, and we do, research. And there's something called researcher bias. And are you looking at data to confirm what you're already looking for? Are you really researching everything to see if you're right or wrong?
Right.
And so those are the things that we have to be self-reflective on. How am I impacting others? Are others impacting me? How am I taking care of myself to stay connected and grounded? And you have to do a lot of self-reflection in order to just keep your own sanity.
Those are some loaded words, to keep your own sanity. Yes, absolutely. And Craig placed into the chat that compassion fatigue is real. It is. And we see it a lot in this space. And so I think that part of what allows, practitioners in this space to be successful and to show up well is because of our passion and empathy for others. But if we aren't also thinking about the need for us to put our oxygen mask on first, then we are going to burn out. We're going to feel the weight of being fatigued. And I worry that if we aren't thinking along those lines, that we could be negatively impacting our effectiveness. And so I appreciate, again, the wonderful reminder. You also said, reflecting on right and wrong. And I also think that part of the growth opportunity is when we're in those self-reflective, moments, is to think about not only is there a right or wrong, but how do we hold the middle? How do we find some common ground, right? Because everything is so nuanced around this work. And I think that the reason that so many people become offended by conversations of inclusion and diversity is because of how we classify diversity. Sometimes we see it as right, wrong, good or bad, superior, inferior, instead of just seeing it as difference. And I think there's some value. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's some value to amplifying that. So I'm going to now spotlight Tracy. She has a question, and so I'm going to bring her into the conversation. Tracy, feel free to unmute yourself and share. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really enjoying this conversation, Kobena. So many things resonated with me, but the last point that you made about self-reflection probably resonated the most. How do you avoid being gaslighted? And I'll tie that to self-reflection, because sometimes in this work, people really make you feel like you don't know what you're talking about. And like, it doesn't really take a competency framework to do this work. Like, oh, anybody can do this. So how do you manage to maintain your competence and your confidence as you continue to move forward in doing the work? Thank you.
Tracy, thank you for sharing that question. You touched on a couple things. Part of this work, it can test your confidence. It can really test your self-confidence because, one, you're pushing against the norm, right? So you think about these major corporations that historically have been male, white, straight, cisgender dominated, and now you're pushing against that. And at a certain point, you may start, what, am I crazy? Am I wrong? Because everybody else is saying, even some people who look like me and come from similar areas, they're saying that I'm not right. So again, that's where that self-reflection is, because the truth is sometimes we might be wrong. It could be our biases, as I was talking about. It could be our bias that's looking for these things. But I would say that to avoid being gaslighted and just kind of pushed around and say, oh, you're just going too far, kind of look at what those people are looking for. You think about the golden rule, right? The golden rule is treat others as you would have them do unto you. But a lot of times what people are moving to is the platinum rule, which is do unto others as they would have you do unto them. And so be reflective of that person and understand how they receive communication and how they understand things as true, or how they are able to be influenced. And so if it's numbers, you may have to share numbers. Somebody put in the chat with them, what's in it for me, right? And so we have to understand that they are people too, they're human. And so they have certain motivators and they have beliefs that have been reinforced over time. And you may be challenging that. So empathize with them. Understand that if somebody's going to tell me that something that I've loved my entire life, I shouldn't be having, you're going to have a strong argument, that connects with me to change my mind. So what is that argument going to be to change that person's mind? I also would say that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Mm-hmm. And so if you're having conversations with people, start with understanding them as a person. You to understand how they receive feedback, but two, it becomes an authentic conversation, not something where you're forcing something else down somebody's throat, because then you just have two different opposing forces just going at each other, and there's not going to be much progress made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for your question, Tracy, and for joining us today. Empathize and educate. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the heart of what I heard you share. Sometimes the empathy is what keeps the conversation going because of that influence. But we also have to educate. While we have their ear, we have to educate, because otherwise that will continue to perpetuate in other relationships and other instances. And so I now want to present a question that was submitted anonymously by someone in our community today. today. Our board of directors is very white, and we know this does not reflect well. This has been a point that many people in the company have brought up. We want to avoid tokenism by not just adding non-white members to our board. It would come off as tokenism. We are implementing mentorship. I'm scrolling down more. We're implementing mentorship and trying to get back to it. I lost my place. Okay, we're implementing mentorship and sponsorship programs to increase mobility with our new hired to be able to change the makeup of those eligible for board nomination in the future. Is there something we can do right now to reflect our allyship and that DEI is in our DNA, you know, while they're waiting for the results of some of the efforts that I just shared?
Well, that's a heavy question. What was that person's name? Oh, Anonymous.
It was sent anonymous, yes.
Thank you, Anonymous. That was a heavy question. What I'd say is that it's similar to recruitment, right? We can't hire people based on their ethnicity or their sexual orientation or their veteran or disabilities ability, diverse ability status. But what we can do is we can, instead of casting out a wider net in the same body of water, because we'll get more of the same, right? So instead, we start sourcing from different lakes and ponds, and we may have to do some spearfishing, right? And target different communities to be a part of the pool. And then once we have a larger and a more representative pool, then we can, again, look within that pool for the skill sets that are needed across the board, regardless of any of those other qualification or any of those desired characteristics.
Yeah.
I think that part of that is also the board is going to take for the board to expand their network as well.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of board positions are created by referrals, right? And so how do those referrals happen? Well, there's some statistics that I recently got that said 90% of all white Americans have a 100% white network. 80% of all Black Americans have a 100% Black network. Latino Hispanic has between 60 and 70, and Asian has between 50 and 60. So if that's the case, then we're getting what you would expect, because the networks are going to stay the same. So what I would encourage you to encourage your board members is to, in the meantime, start to engage them in different community events and different networks so that they can start to build their understanding of different cultures and different people, and show so that they can learn the beauty and be exposed to all the ingenuity and the value that those different communities inherently have, but also that they have in common with what you're looking for.
Yeah, no, Kobena, I think that's really sage advice. The other thing that I would add for this particular guest who has presented the question is that the realization that no one starts out at their final destination. So I think that it is incredibly useful to lean into that vulnerability and be transparent about, here's what we know to be an opportunity, and here's what we're doing about it to help change that over time. And then allow the credibility to come from the evidence that the organization is truly exercising those action items to deliver a different outcome in terms of your board representation and makeup. I think people will can much better appreciate that approach than just almost ignoring it and not talking about it, because it makes people to perceive that maybe you aren't even aware that it is a challenge. And so I also would share the suggestion of having those key stakeholders to lean into communicating, you know, the current state and how you're hoping to change and what you're planning to do to create that change. Awesome. So I just want to open it up. I don't see any other hands raised right now. I do want to give space and time maybe for someone else who is thinking of a question you would like to present. So I have another question, Kobena, while maybe the audience is still noodling on perhaps their curiosities. You mentioned as we were preparing for today's podcast that you are working on a white paper, content area that's, really something that you have a lot of energy and passion around, and we won't ask you to give it all away. But if you can give us just the premise and maybe a sneak peek of perhaps what we can look forward to with the release of this white paper.
Yeah, so it's really around the 5 R's. So when you think about the different nuances or different indicators of DE and I have an invisible disability. So on January 25th, I got a new kidney. So I had been on dialysis for 2.5 years. On August 5th, I found out that, or on August 5th, I was told you need to go to the emergency room and start dialysis. And then that afternoon, after I got put on dialysis, they said, hey, if you hadn't come, you probably had 2 days left to live.
Wow.
And so then 2.5 years later, I got the kidney. And as I was sitting there, I was just, for whatever reason, was just energized. And I said, you know what? I need to start putting some of the stuff that I've done and that I've been, kind of preaching for so long, just put it down on paper. And I started creating my first white paper on the, 5 strategic areas of DEI strategy.
That is great. So when will this white paper release? Do you have a sense of that?
Hopefully by the end of next month.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we will definitely make sure that we're checking in with you. We'll love to be able to share it out with this community. So I now want to shift and I want to talk about some of the ways in which you help companies to create environments where all employees can show up at their best and have a strong sense of belonging. What are maybe those top 2 to 3 strategies that you often will communicate?
Yeah, so again, it goes into that network space, right? Because a lot of this, as you talked about, is educational and it's exposure, it's experience. And a lot of people don't know what they don't know, and they don't know that they don't know it. And so creating what I would like to do is create spaces where different people from different backgrounds are even strategically placed together. So for example, if there's an event, like we had I worked with a company and we sponsored a golf event, and we had, the majority of the executives were white, and so and the event was for a predominantly Black community, and so I reached out to our business resource group, and I targeted 5 executives and 5 members of the business resource group that normally wouldn't have access to higher level representatives. And those representatives would never have conversations with people who may be, in less than a director. Now they're able to, in a very relaxed setting, have conversations and organically address things that that people go through on a regular basis. So nice. Just being strategic and thoughtful around opportunities to create those spaces for conversations to be had. Again, it's about organic, authentic conversations, not forced. And if those conversations don't happen that moment, that's fine. But at least now those 2 people, in most cases, they're going to exchange information, or they're going to say, that leader's going to say, hey, if you ever need anything, give me a call. So now the door is open. So they can have further conversations moving forward. It doesn't have to stop there.
I totally agree. I've been talking a lot lately about this push and pull that I'm seeing in a lot of organizations. Sometimes we have to realize we're planting seeds, although we want to be able to see, the full fruits of the tree, we're planting seeds. And then you have some individuals within the organization feel like we're not going hard enough. We're not hitting this hard. We're not really being as aggressive and assertive with trying to operationalize DEIB. And then you have others that are of the persuasion, we need to slow walk this. People are uncomfortable. So we need to make sure we're bringing them along in a way that feels safe for them. And, part of the superpowers of DEI practitioners is, again, holding the middle, trying to address both. Let's not keep those who are really ready for deepened learning and deepened conversations from being able to take that step. But let's also make sure we aren't leaving the others behind, and doing it in a way where they see that part of the discomfort is the growth and part of the journey. So we have to lean into that. So are you seeing that in some of the, maybe the relationships and organizations that you've been in communication with? Is that pull and pull, push and pull
absolutely.
type of challenge? Yeah.
Absolutely. I liken it to like working out, so if anybody has ever worked out had a really good workout that next day, they're probably sore. Their muscles, they couldn't lift their arms, or it was tender to walk, right? And so what's actually happening is those muscles are being torn. And those muscles are being torn, and then they heal back together bigger and stronger. And so that's what this is. It's about tearing, your current norms a little bit. And you don't want to go too far, because then you tear a muscle and now you're back at square one.
Yes.
Right? So it's that balance of, how do I move into my challenge zone and not into my chaos zone, but stay in that challenge zone so that I don't tear the muscle, but I'm building muscle every day.
I love that analogy, especially for one who is always communicating to her personal trainer. Yes, no, I want to feel it, but I'm feeling it too much right now. What is that balance? So I can come back the next day, right? That's really critical. Well,
I think what is also good though is you think about that, that feeling is because you had a good workout. So that motivates you to go back the next day. Like, I had a good workout yesterday.
Yes, but if you take me too far, I'm like, okay, I'm not returning, right?
Exactly.
So it's a delicate balance. So I think that analogy was so great. So I appreciate you sharing that. So we're getting close to the top of the hour. One of the things that I often like to do, Kobena, and this because, again, I'm a friend of this podcast community, is while we've touched on a lot, there could be some other things that maybe that you're holding, that you're having a lot of energy and passion for. I just want to give you a chance to close us out by sharing anything that maybe we have not talked about today that you think is important and relevant for this audience to know. And then also let us know what's on the horizon for you. What can we expect next from Kobena?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So my advice, my closing statement to this group is just engage. Just get in there and do it. Don't be afraid. And be empathetic for people, because we don't know what's going on in their lives. Always try to check yourself and say, are they doing this because they're trying to be malicious, or is there a blind point? Is there a blind spot here for them, or do they have something else going on in their personal life that's not allowing them to hear me at this time? But get into the work, be empathetic, be vulnerable. Oftentimes you're going to have to lead with that vulnerability, because, until they see that it's safe, that's how you create those safe spaces. Talk about psychological safety. We didn't really get into that today, but that is one of the keys to successful DEI, is creating psychologically safe spaces where people can be their true, authentic self, share feedback openly and honestly, and not have to filter themselves, because then that feedback is not really as valuable as it could be.
Absolutely. And what's next for you?
I'm a humble servant, so I'm just trying to continue to, share anything that I can. And, what's big for me and always has been is connecting people in this space. So if there's anybody that, is looking to do something, if I can help, that's really all I want to do, is help people reach their goals. And understanding that, and that's what led me to this DEI space, is I know there's a lot of people who aren't getting an equitable chance to reach their full potential. And that's what I'm trying to do in the space. So if I have a network or a connection that I could share for you.
That is great. Well, we are so delighted that we were able to visit with you today during our Intentional Conversations podcast. And again, we're appreciative of you being a part of this community week in, week out. I hope that this has been fruitful for each of you who have joined us today. Wishing you all a beautiful and safe weekend. And hopefully we'll see you back next week for Intentional Conversations podcast. Thank you all so very much.